And welcome everybody. I'll introduce myself in just a minute. Let me get myself set up here. We're going to be talking about outcome-based plans today, and I noticed that my company, as we go through it, the main thing here is we're looking at, in the Agile world, kind of as we shift from the typical way of managing projects into a more flow-based management of projects, and how are we inspecting and adapting on our plans. So the way I like to think of outcome-based plans is results-driven plans over plan-driven results. And so we'll be going through that today. I'm Greg DiPasquale. This is a little bit about me. So I'm currently in Charlotte, North Carolina, by way of Washington, D.C. When I met Leland back at our transformation that we were working on, I was living in D.C. and we were flying up to Michigan, working at a dental insurance company, was our client. I'm currently with Leading Agile, who I noticed was one of the sponsors of this group. And I'm an expedition lead, which I'll get into a little bit about what that is as we go through here and how it relates to outcome-based plans. And then some of my personal favorite things down there below. Big Bills fan, Capitals Nationals fans from DC, families from Buffalo. That's how that connection is. And then I lived in DC. And then one of my favorite business books right now, which if you're interested, if you do a lot of reading around Agile and those kinds of things, is Never Split the Difference. It's by Chris Voss. It's not an Agile book per se, but in a transformation world, it has a lot of communication tools about negotiation that I really think helps you in the client-consultant relationship in moving people forward. So check it out if you get the chance. Really good read. Not very repetitive, has a lot of new stuff in each chapter and builds on it. All right. So with that, we'll just kind of jump into the agenda. So what we're going to be covering today: what are outcome-based plans, and why do we use them? Characteristics of organizations using outcome-based plans versus activity-based plans. This is kind of diagnosing the environments that you're in. If you're working in a major company, large enterprise, complex enterprise, you'll see some traits that will represent kind of how they are planning their work, and will help you distinguish them there. And then we'll go into what are the conditions that we need for successful outcome-based plan execution. So before we even try to run a plan and succeed with it, we're going to need certain conditions in place to do so, to really enable us to make that plan work. So happy to have you guys jump in with questions, as long as I'm going to try to get through all the material. But if we make this a dialogue, I'd love that. Helps contextualize the information for everyone. So feel free to jump in at any point with your questions and feedback. All right. So what are our outcome-based plans, and why should we use them? So from our point of view, when we're looking at it from a transformation point of view, an outcome-based plan is a pathway to a defined end state. And when we're talking about an end state, it's where are we going from a transformation perspective? So are we trying to become more predictable? Or are we trying to become more adaptable as a business unit, as an organization, or as a team of teams? Or it's a pathway to a particular business objective. So if you think of it from an OKR perspective, objectives and key results, it can also be applied to systems. So if you're building a specific software project or product for a group of customers, how does it apply? How do you get from the starting point to the actual objective you and your customers want to achieve? So what's important about an outcome-based plan is that it enables measurable results along the way. And it's meant to continuously align your tactical activities to your strategic outcomes. So key characteristics that we find with outcome-based plans are we have clear success criteria. So obviously in the Agile world, we're very big on success criteria and acceptance criteria as we kind of move down the epic feature story stack. Same thing with an outcome-based plan. We really want to be paying attention to how are we connecting the objectives that we have with the definition of success? How do we know when we're done? The activities that we're focused on executing get tailored as we go. And this comes back to that results-driven plan. We don't want to follow the same set of activities knowing that the outcome that we're looking for isn't necessarily going to be achieved. Business results are the measure of progress. So as we say in Agile, getting back to working tested product as the primary measure of progress, we're looking at it from a transformation if we're looking at it from a transformation perspective, how do we measure that we're actually transforming an organization, having an impact on the ability to deliver product to customers? And then measurable value accrues incrementally. So as we inspect and adapt our activities, we want to be able to measure the outcomes on an incremental basis and watch that accrue to ultimately achieve the outcome that we're looking for and know when it's been achieved so we can make the appropriate stop, start, or change decisions along the way. So why do we use them? We want to align our execution to our end state vision. So in a transformation state, if we're looking at a major organization and we need to know how far we want to go from a transformation perspective, we can go from, turning the dial, as we like to say, from, 0 to 10, how far on that dial do we need to go? So we'd like to set that stage up front. How predictable do we want our teams to be? Maybe our problem that we're trying to solve is that we can't deliver regularly on a regular cadence for our customers. So really the focus of agility for our transformation would be predictability. Whereas if we're more focused on speed and adaptability because we're in a startup type environment or an R&D type environment, we may have to turn the dial a little bit further towards another end state. So we want to get at least an end state hypothesis before we get started, which will inform our outcome-based plan and the pathway to get there. Creates urgency and direction for outcomes. So when we're looking at the pathway, it's easy, it's explicit, and it aligns groups of teams and individuals to where we're going. And we can point back to it transparently and talk about it openly as far as how we're moving along that pathway or if we need to adjust course. Drives incremental business results on the path to realizing the end state vision. So we'll get into that in a little bit. I'm going to go through a few examples of what that looks like and how it applies to Agile transformation, how it applies to a development of a system, an enterprise system, and then how it also could apply to the hypothetical of an NFL team season. It enables leadership to identify and remove specific obstacles to change. And again, this is about adaptation and the ability to have a convergent path rather than a divergent path to getting to an outcome. So kind of on the right-hand side, we've got this picture of this divergent path, and we really want to have teams and leaders converge around a single outcome and become very focused on achieving that within the guardrails of that pathway. It anchors communications to visible path forward. Again, creating transparency, the ability to inspect and adapt, key in the Agile world, as well as just from a perspective of being successful in achieving the results that we're looking for. And then if we're looking at adapting the plan and the activities underneath, we need to provide some flexibility and some scalability for change when working in complex enterprises. So it also enables that. So really quickly, because this is the scaled, we're talking about scaled Agile here. Right before I get into the outcome-based plan example from a transformation perspective, want to make sure that we're aligned on this is a team of teams structure. So as we kind of evaluate at scale what we need to achieve from an outcomes perspective for transformation, we're not just talking about the tier at the delivery team level. And we're not just talking about the tier at the two tiers of the product team and the delivery teams. We need each tier in the stack to be aligned to the plan and to be able to measure the results ultimately of the Agile system that we're transforming to. So as an example, this is from our, if you're familiar with leading Agile and our approach to transformation, this is what we call Basecamp 1. And so if we're looking, if you think of that team of teams structure that we just took a look at, we're going to start with the structure of the team. So we're going to evaluate, are the teams that we have formed today focusing on value for the customer, or are they focused around components or some other formation? Maybe there's a matrixed formation within the company. And the first thing we're going to do is restructure the teams into stable, dedicated Agile teams. And we call that forming teams. So it's focused on the delivery, the product, and the portfolio tier at a minimum. And if we have a larger, more complex system, there may be additional tiers. It really depends on the environment that we're working in, and we adapt to that and the complexity of that environment. So the first thing we're going to do is form teams. So in order to get to the results of Basecamp 1 on our outcome-based plan, which is the predictable delivery of working tested product, we need to have these stable teams in place. Foundationally, that's our first outcome. So underneath that outcome, we'd be looking at activities like going through roles and responsibilities with the team members. So if we're putting new teams together, we want to make sure everyone's informed and aware and educated on their new responsibilities. We want to train them on the Agile techniques that we'll be using. So are we going to be in a more iterative version with Scrum, or are we going to leverage more of a flow-based model like Kanban? And then we'll move into our next outcome. So we want to try to achieve the first outcome in our plan, so form teams, and then move into establishing the flow of work. And that would be, how are we governing the work through the system with a series of Kanbans at each tier of the model that you saw on the previous slide. And we'd be talking about measuring that flow through with lead time and cycle time, and watching that stabilize. Or if we're working with Scrum, we'd be looking at velocity and the velocity variance. But we want to baseline our metrics because we need to measure the business results of the change that we're implementing over time. So it's important to baseline those metrics there. So as we move through the rest of the outcomes, we can incrementally measure and demonstrate transparent, objective business results based on the correlation to the Agile methods that we're teaching all of the teams. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions so far.
Wasn't really any questions in the chat. Someone was just, you said you were going to move to some examples in a minute, and I think that was one of the requests, that you had some examples.
Okay. Cool. So this would be an outcome-based plan for transformation. So this is how we actually do it in the leading Agile reference architecture. So this is what we apply when we go into an organization. And the first base camp, we have a 5 base camp model. The first base camp is really creating predictability in large organizations who have a more matrixed ad hoc approach to delivery systems. So this would be the Agile transformation example of an outcome-based plan. So you have your 8 outcomes, and then you will have your ultimate outcome that you're looking for from a business perspective. Does that make sense from the example for transformation? Is anyone leveraging an outcome-based approach to transformation in their own companies or with their own clients?
Yes. So Greg, it's Max. Can you hear me well?
Yeah. I can.
So I was the one that put in the chat the question, and I was asking if you have examples, like I work with this particular team and here's where they were before, and actually take us through the steps. Now, that might not be in the scope of the presentation for today. It was just a question I had, right?
Sure. And that, I think, so these would be the outcomes that we're looking for. We won't be going through all of the activities underneath, but to your question, each one of these outcomes has a series of activities that we would do with the teams. And those activities would be tailored based on where the team was and what the team might need to operate in their environment so that we could achieve these outcomes.
Yes. Got it. Thank you.
Sure. But yeah, we could go very deep into this at some point because
it'll be 3 hours long, but yeah, not just 50 minutes.
Yep. I get to teach this quite a bit on site, and yeah, there's a lot to it. But happy to do another one of these and go deep into this at some point.
Got it. Thanks, Greg.
Sure.
Greg, before you move on, can you share a little more about the rolling backlog and what kind of we're looking for in that outcome?
Sure. At that point, at each tier, we're looking at the ability to shift priorities with the needs of the business at each tier. So from an epic backlog, a feature backlog, and then a delivery team backlog, all of them are working in alignment, really driven by that top tier of epics to be able to be prioritized, reprioritized, and refined on a rolling basis to as it's driven by the roadmap. So trying to think of a good example at my automotive client, what we were seeing at the epic level, I was working in a group called Connected Vehicle. And when we got started there, they had, I think, about 7 years worth of backlog. And they weren't in what we would define as typical epic size. They were 5-year epics, but that's kind of how they planned. So there was really a fixed notion of what they were going to do for the next 5 years. We wouldn't want to shrink that batch size. And as we get into that rolling backlog, we're looking at, okay, how do we adjust and pivot quickly, make stop decisions to take work out of process and move the things that really need to be worked from a customer value perspective into process without shocking the system. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So how do we know that we're achieving outcomes when we're looking at an Agile transformation? So we do it in 2 ways. We really, as we go through those outcomes, we run cadenced assessments with each team in the delivery tier. So at the delivery tier, we'd run every 2 weeks, we would assess the proficiencies of the team are we getting better at the things that we intended to? So if we're focused on formed teams, we would expect the bar at the top, teams are formed, to increase based on the activities that we were performing with the team, the coaching that we were doing on the ground, the impact we were having on their backlogs, and the flow of work in their governance structure. So we would be looking at that particular, the impact that we're making. We'd be assessing that through working with the teams and collecting their feedback. And then and most importantly, we'd move to the right-hand side and we'd also measure the results. So we're going to start looking at the things. This is mostly based on what would be a Scrum team, but we would also have a measurement for Kanban teams at each tier in the system. And we'd be looking at the trends over time. So sprint over sprint, every couple weeks or once a month, typically for product and portfolio level teams. Are we seeing the trend go in the right direction from a stability standpoint? So remember, we're going from an unpredictable system from Basecamp 0, we call it, or an ad hoc system, to Basecamp 1, we would be looking for trends towards predictability. So are we able to complete, are we completing what we're planning to complete month over month? How's our velocity variance? Are we getting more accurate at predicting our capacity that we actually have to meet the demand of our team? What's the impact of staff availability on that trend? So do we have a dedicated staff? I'm sure a lot of you work in organizations where there's matrices, and that can detract from the dedicated, stable team that really lends itself to predictability in an agile sense. And then so on and so forth. So are we getting more confident in our releases? And are we reducing defects? And do we have a deep enough backlog, number of ready sprints, to keep us, make sure the team isn't starved and is always working on the right thing at the right time to create value for our customers?
Hey, Greg, this is Brian. When do the results on the right-hand side of this slide start becoming outputs instead of outcomes? Because what we really want to do is to deliver business value, but I get kind of where you're going, that you gotta at least do these sorts of things to get the quote unquote infrastructure set up for your teams. But at some point, if you're only focusing on these things on the right, I think you can miss the mark on producing the value for the business.
So if we're doing this, these measures are predicated on having a backlog that the team is working on that is prioritized and aligned to their customers' needs. So if we have a stable team and we have a prioritized backlog that is aligned to the customer value that they want to see most at the top, then as these numbers stabilize, we should be seeing more of that value delivered on a more consistent basis. Does that help? Or were you asking a different question?
Yeah, I think that helps. I think when, a lot of times when business is trying to measure the outcome isn't really how many stories were done or how many story points or that whatnot, but it's really what the business outcome was achieved by completing those stories, by completing those releases, by deploying every 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or whatever at the end of every sprint.
That's right. So we're looking at improving the system of delivery. So how are we delivering that value? So those represent the throughput of that value and the delivery of that as it goes to the roadmap, the product roadmap. This would be the release plans around that roadmap, and then ultimately the backlog that's driving that. So it is connected to the value. These are focused on the transformation outcomes. So you're right. That's exactly what that's exactly correct. And then that impacts the ability of the delivery outcomes that we're looking for as we transform.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Mhm. All right, so I used to work on a system. I was a systems engineer before I went exclusively into the Agile world. So I wanted to kind of apply this a little bit to when I was building this global enrollment system. So what we were doing is really modernizing the Trusted Traveler programs system, and working with one directorate who had the old version and migrating it over to a new version, upgrading all the algorithms and everything behind the scenes, and the data hydration and contextualization for the folks who used it at Customs and Border Protection. So these are some hypothetical examples. I didn't want to get too deep into the actual details, but there were certain things that as we went through, the business, what the business was asking for were these types of things. So they had objectives. One of them was, let's reduce the processing time of the global enrollment applications per traveler. And so there was a fairly repetitive process where applications are processed by a real human, and they're looking at a screen and evaluating some data, and then approving or disapproving that person for the particular program. And the idea was the new system, we needed to be faster at doing that than the old system, because the backlog of travelers as the program got more and more popular, got deeper and deeper. So we wanted to be able to do it faster. Supporting activities. So if we're looking at our objective, so what is our business result that we're trying to create? It was that was one of the things that we wanted to do with the system. The key result, the absolute measurable success factor, was less than 3 minutes was success. Anything greater than 3 minutes was not. And then supporting activities to do those kinds of things, this would be part of the plan. So we're looking at our outcome, our objective, and then the activities we were building out to accomplish that particular reduction of application time. So those were examples of things that we could do to reduce the processing time per traveler to under the key result measurement. The important thing to note is that wasn't always what was happening. So as you're building a system, activities can come into play that aren't focused on supporting that key result. And that's when we need to step back and look at it and go, are the things that we're doing on our day-to-day basis impacting that objective and reducing the time of processing, or are they aimed at some other thing? And so that's where kind of gold plating comes in, or over engineering and those kinds of things. So it's always balancing that path towards that objective with activities that support your outcomes. And then another example below, another objective was we wanted to reduce the backlog to a more manageable level, and similarly had additional supporting activities, not always aimed at the system itself, but actually the humans who were using the system. How do we help them do it more effectively? How do we direct the resources in a way that our capacity is aligned with demand against the 4 different programs that were being processed through the Trusted Traveler or the global enrollment system? And all of that was focused around one of the missions of Customs and Border Protection is expediting legitimate trade and travel. So how do we get people across the border faster when they're returning from trips overseas? That is the overarching mission. Those objectives support that mission. The key results are measurable and help us understand if we're accomplishing that mission. And then this is my take on the NFL season. So I did a podcast a while ago about outcome-based plans. And I was using the analogy of NFL teams. The season was just getting started. For those of you who are sports fans, at the beginning of COVID, there weren't any sports. I was super excited for the NFL. So I tried to tie this all into an NFL package here. So with as you start an NFL season, the first thing you're doing is you want to improve your team. So you want to make adjustments to the team that you had last year and fill in any gaps in the strengths, or you want to shore up your strengths and you want to improve upon your areas of weakness by getting the right personnel in place to get your team ready to compete for the ultimate outcome, winning the Super Bowl at the end of the year. Once you have that team in place, you're there, really want to coach, be able to prepare your team through coaching and game plan study. And so activities under these outcomes, again, are various depending on what you're actually trying to accomplish. And that could go week to week in the NFL. You're adjusting to the play style of your opponent, which ties into how do you win games. And ultimately, it becomes fairly linear in a sports world where you're focused on winning, and that's what gets you to your division title, which gives you the best seeding in the playoffs, which gives you the best chance to win your conference, and then ultimately win the championship at the end of the season. The one thing that I kind of wanted to focus on for a second is, or take a minute to talk about, is in a game plan in an NFL game, most of the first series of plays from an offensive perspective are scripted. So you come in with an assumption around what your opponent's going to do, and you think you have a way of beating that style of play. So if you are playing an opponent, you start off an opponent that has a presumably weak defensive line, you might choose to run a lot of running plays at that line to evaluate that weakness. You hear a lot about the important thing, though, for coaches who do things well in the NFL is that they inspect and adapt very quickly to the game plan that they're seeing is either effective or not effective. So when we get back into the activities, we come in with an assumption, a hypothesis around what's going to happen, and then we quickly inspect and adapt to pivot. And so I think coaches in the NFL who do really well, as long as they have a team that's good enough to actually execute it, often do it because they are looking at what's going on in the field and they're inspecting play by play or adapting play by play rather than waiting for what used to be known as the halftime adjustment, right? And then at the end of the season, if you've won the Super Bowl, there are business results associated with that. So you've got more people buying more merchandise, you get increased ticket prices, upsold tickets, and then revenue from TV and share from the league. All right, so we're going to go into a little bit about outcome versus activity-based plans. So what does this look like? What is an organization that uses an outcome-based plan versus an activity-based plan versus maybe no plan? What are some characteristics around that? So when I go into an organization, and I don't do this necessarily explicitly, but when you start to look at traits of the organization that you're working in, trying to help transform, you want to be able to evaluate what type of planning they're using. And it's broken into two sections here. So this is the planning section. And then what does it look like when you execute, which is the next slide over behind this one. So in outcome-based planning, we want to make sure that our strategic and tactical goals are aligned as we go. So, or planned collaboratively. So that we have a shared understanding of the direction we're going in and how the tactical execution, tactical goals support the strategic ones. And this is commonly, in a 3-tier model from a In an ideal Agile system, we have the success criteria of the epics tied to the features, acceptance criteria tied to stories and tasks that contribute up the stack and down the stack to a common goal. Same thing with outcome-based plans from a transformation perspective or a systems perspective. We want to be able to cascade those things effectively in a shared, with a shared understanding. Activities based plans tend to be cascaded top down, so the goals come from the top. And then no plan, we don't have, we have undefined strategic goals, or they change very frequently. Has anyone experienced an organization that shares any traits of either of those three types of planning techniques? All right, no takers. All right, so going down, we have, I'll let you kind of start to read through these, but there's, when we're looking at outcomes, again, it's focused on value. We want to be hyper-focused on, are we delivering value? To the point we were discussing earlier, how do those transformation measures tie to the delivery measures? We always want to be focused on how do we reduce the time to value for our customer and move things incrementally rather than big bang. And then we've got the focus on the triple constraint in a lot of major organizations who still do fixed planning cycles on the yearly basis. So fixed budgets, fixed scope, and fixed schedule over the course of typically a year or at least multiple quarters. And those things get fairly locked in towards the beginning of the year and aren't able to be easily changed throughout the execution cycle. Outcome-based plans, we're going to do iterative planning cycles, inspect and adapt. And then, as mentioned earlier, when you're looking at an outcome-based plan, you're looking at it from a results perspective. Are we getting what we intend to be getting from a business results perspective by executing the way we are? And if we aren't, what are the things that we have to do to adjust? Activity-based plans, currently working in a large DoD contractor, and they have what are known as integrated master schedules, which are major program schedules that really drive all of the things that are supposed to be delivered in the time frame in which they're supposed to be delivered on extremely complex programs. So that's a very vivid example of a plan-driven results. There's assumptions that the thing that we know at the beginning is going to hold true throughout the execution of the project. And those are very difficult to change without some real major readjustments to contracts and the business the financials potentially. So it makes it it's a very rigid process. And then focusing on learning and adapting on the outcome side, analyzing and planning. So can we get this right up front? We spend a lot of time in the integrated master schedule world of really doing a lot of upfront analysis to cascade that down in a very waterfall fashion against an IMS and execute in that way. Rewarding business impact versus rewarding task completion. So in the activity-driven world, the focal point tends to shift at some point to, are we getting a lot of stuff? Are we completing a lot of tasks? But those tasks don't always result in measurable business impact. And so there's a lot of things happening, but not necessarily a lot of value being delivered to customers. So we always want to be conscious of that. So we're looking at some of the symptoms of different planning styles in this slide. And then here's some of the things, some of the ways it kind of ends up looking, or some of the ways it looks when you're actually executing an outcome-based plan versus an activity-based plan or no plan. Again, we're looking at, can we measure the business results of what we're doing? Are we having the impact we hypothesized that we were going to have? Or do we need to adjust our hypothesis to something new and make take a different turn? Progress measured by the number of activities complete. So are we tracking to our schedule as according to the tasks on that schedule? Reviewing business results early and often. Reviewing versus reviewing activity completion status or going to status meetings. And then always fun, how much stuff are we doing right now as the measure of success on the no plan side? So how much WIP do we have in process? The more WIP, the better. So as you kind of go down here, you kind of get the pattern. One of the other, I think, more the bottom two rows are two of my favorite rows on here. Those, where are your resources focused when you're running against outcomes versus activities? In outcomes, you've got them results focused. So can we stop, change? Do we need to stop, change, or continue based on have we achieved the results that we intended to achieve? And pivot those folks to a new project based on that results versus the utilization focus. So that's something that you'll see in most matrixed organizations is, are we fully utilized? Are our employees busy throughout the 8 hours of their workday? And then the WIP is another key aspect of things. So are we enforcing WIP limits? Are we trying to keep WIP out of the system so that we can get more value delivered to our customers? So can we reduce our WIP? Can we enforce that to create focus around our resources to deliver value to our customers? Activity, most organizations that I've visited that come into, there's a lot of activity, a lot of WIP in the system. So one of the more counterintuitive things for clients to do is to stop doing some of the things, some of the work that's already in process. Having success there helps organizations transform effectively, but is a tricky conversation depending on as you try to work with them to really focus on what are the highest priorities and why are we doing so many things at once. All right, so we get into a little bit about the conditions for the successful execution of outcome-based plans. So what organizational traits, what leadership do you need to have in place to be able to effectively execute an outcome-based plan? So we talk a lot about clearing in conditions from a transformation perspective at Leading Agile. And what that means is creating safety for coaches to effectively work with teams to change the behaviors and techniques they use within their system to deliver effectively for their customers. So some of the preconditions, some of the conditions that we need from a leadership team in order to do that are committed, just the commitment, unified commitment, really. So it's really important to have aligned leadership at the executive level, as well as the the tiers below the executives, so that we can drive the right patterns and behaviors for structure, workflow, and measurement in the system that we're trying to change. That leadership needs to be not only unified, but engaged. So what we tend to do in a transformation environment is, if as coaches, we are working with teams at any of those tiers that we showed you earlier, so the delivery, the product, or the program tier, or portfolio tier, and we end up with an impediment that as a coach, we don't have the permission to remove, we're going to go ask for executives to help and to help remove an impediment. It might be a technical impediment, or it might be team members who are not bought in to the change that we're trying to make, but we may have to go ask for that help for executives to lean in and have the right conversations to help us move forward and attain those measurable results that we're looking for. Leaders need to feel empowered and accountable for those outcomes themselves. So we want to co-create the plan with the executive leadership and other organizational leaders, so that folks are bought in, engaged, and feel committed and accountable for creating the outcomes that we're looking for. Talked a little bit about the escalations that we want to have. Escalations are not necessarily a bad thing in this context. They're just the reality of, if we don't move an obstacle, we're not going to be able to progress towards the goals that we've set or the objectives we're trying to achieve. And then consistent and persistent communications around, why are we doing what we're doing? So we have our transparent outcome-based plan that we've aligned to an end state vision that we're going towards. We've created the pathway with the outcome-based plan. It's transparent, it's co-created, we have buy-in, and then over the course of time, as we're running through a transformation, we need to have consistent and persistent communications and messaging from our leaders that say, stay the course, remember why we're doing this, remember the outcomes we're trying to achieve, in order to help align the organization and keep the progress moving forward. And then as we start to look at what are some of the things, if we're going to kind of check some boxes prior to getting started with an agile transformation and at scale, what are some of the things that we need to have in place that will really help enable a smoother ride of transition for not only the executive sponsors, but the team members themselves and the coaches who are working with the teams to achieve. So in this case, we've talked a little bit about the end state hypothesis, or the clear objectives and key results. Structure, governance, and metrics. So how are we structuring the teams for success around customer value? How are we pointing those groups of teams at customer value? How are we flowing the work through the system? And what measurements are going to enable us to prove objectively that we're achieving those goals? And then moving into kind of how are we collecting those metrics? So what tools do we have to collect the metrics? If you're working in a major system, of course, you can always do this stuff manually with physical boards. Now that we're in COVID times, I've been working exclusively remotely with my clients for the past 6 months. And so we're using our ALM tool, configuring it to collect the metrics that we've agreed to, so that we can demonstrate incremental measurable business results that are correlated with the transformation outcomes we've achieved during the transformation. And then it looks like we've got about 5 minutes left, and this is about the end of the presentation, but I wanted to give you guys a chance for any questions and feedback while we have a few more minutes.
Trying to just go through some of the chat. There was some discussions around the metrics inside here. The ones that you had, right, that
so this particular slide.
Yep. Just more question around, you know, which metric identifies value that is delivered to determine it's truly outcome-based planning. So do you have a metric in there around the value being delivered? There was a lot of chat about that one, so it seemed like that was a lot of discussion around those seemed to be a little more output-based and not outcome-based.
Yes, so these are the, again, that system of, well, these would be the system of delivery metrics. So it would be the assumption that we're working on here is that the backlogs that we're working from have been prioritized according to value. So if we're looking at these as, yes, we're stabilizing the system of delivery, we still are working from a prioritized backlog. So the top things in that backlog, however the prioritization scheme is working, ostensibly on customer value, those things are being delivered on a more consistent basis is what these metrics would be telling us. We would have to look into the backlog itself and make sure that we're prioritized, refined, and the proper work is ready and the values are assigned properly as we went through these particular outcomes of transformation.
Hey, Greg, maybe talk about on your system of delivery slide showing portfolio, product, and delivery, what might be the measures be that are value focused for portfolio and product teams?
What might be the measures that
yes, if looking at that, if looking at those measures that we saw, we're delivery team, and the outcome that we're going for is stable and predictable teams, right? The concern is that I don't see value in there. So what are the outcomes that we look for in early transformation, and how that are aligned to value, and how do we measure that value, and where does it show up? Product and portfolio.
Right. So looking at the kind of the reduction of cycle time around epics and features at that portfolio and product team level. So how are we reducing that time, that delivery to value, that time to value of proposition for the customer at those two levels? Is that answering the question? I'm not sure that I'm getting at it.
I don't know, Jack, if you want to ask more questions.
So the problem with that is that cycle time and lead time, while they're very good metrics, they don't define that any value has actually been delivered. So you spoke about Kanban at the higher levels. So I'm going to quote Anderson from his Fit for Purpose book. He would basically say that any type of throughput metric that counts how many things are delivered without qualifying the value of that thing or the quality of that thing is not considered a good metric. It would be considered a vanity metric. And so I haven't seen any measure at the product team level or portfolio team level of your process here that defines fit for purpose types of metrics, which is what Anderson promotes. I mean, if you're going to do Kanban method at the higher levels,
Mhm.
then you have to use KMM and fit for purpose. And I don't see any of that. So all I see are throughput metrics, which are associated with output versus outcome. And so the plan is, my perspective is what you've presented is output, not outcome, unless you can designate a measure at these levels to prove differently.
Sure. Yeah, and typically there'd be dollar values associated with things in your, in your backlog. So the throughput is associated by the higher value items moving through. Also, the mission focus kind of in the global enrollment system, there were prioritized things that the business customers were looking for based on their understanding of their customers. So that reduction in processing time and things like that. So the items.
So the processing time, I could deliver a bunch of crap quicker and quicker, and that does not designate value.
Yep. No,
That would be an output-based metric, not an outcome-based metric. So if you're building your plan based, see, metrics drive behavior, good or bad, and we often consider metrics that are associated with Agile and Lean to be all good metrics, but they're not. It depends on how you use them. So, for example, I could have a performance metric that is actually not a KPI. It could be more associated with the general health indicator or something like that, where we want to keep it within a certain range, and then we're good to go. But it's not a KPI, and it's not a fit for purpose metric either. And that's what Anderson's book is all about. So I think there's a gap in your logic here on this on how this is presented. I think there's because I don't see value. I don't see outcome-based planning here. I see output-based planning unless you can identify specific metrics that a team is pulling towards for that purpose. And I'm sorry, but I have another meeting I have to go to. It's after my lunch break, but I appreciate your time.
All right, thanks.
Hey, this is Brian again. That was sort of what I was getting to, Greg, but I think you were saying these are outcome-based when you're in the transition, and they kind of let you know when you've completed the transition. And that's why I was kind of saying, okay, so when do we stop measuring that? Because I mean, I have the problem with my company that we try to measure those things too much, and had a particular organization that all they would do is tell the business how they've improved velocity, and they're delivering, more and more and more on stories, but the value really wasn't there. And there is a gap there where you have to pull the business in better than maybe they were, but you don't want your development organization only focusing on sprint velocity and story points and the rest of that.
That's right. So yeah, I understand, and that's you end up can cook the books that way too if you're not aligned with some other higher value business value.
Yes, so, manage to the metric, right?
That's right.
So, and that's why I was trying to get you to kind of say, when do you when of those aren't as important anymore, and then it's really, all right, did we do, and you started some of it, right? Did you get screen load times to go down because the business think that's gonna, drive, people to the site or drive people to pay for this service, right? Are you, reducing the time to process somebody's, those are the kind of things that eventually you want to get to instead of sprint times and how many stories and all that.
Right, and that's more product and the product fit in system specific, right? So it depends on the context that you're working in, what the value context is, and that's where this was more at that from a transformation perspective. How are we stable? What are we stabilizing the teams? The alignment to value is happening as we go through these outcomes. But that's very contextual. So yeah, I wasn't really digging in deep there.
And I think some of the confusion comes from clarifying what is the outcome that you're trying to obtain, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, value is an important outcome. It is only one of them. If you're organization that you're working with is not able to deliver, then perhaps one of the initial outcomes that you need to achieve is stable delivery, right? So
Yep.
that once you've been able to achieve that, to what extent, and that's a great question, like what does stable delivery mean for us? What does that look like so that we can move on from it? Then you can pivot and focus more deeply on what are the elements of value within the delivery, right? So it's a progression. I don't think it's an either or, but it's a sequencing.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
All right. Well, Greg, we are at time. We're a few minutes over, but
Cool.
so yeah, how would you, if others had questions, what's the best way to reach you?
You can reach out at my email address is greg.depasquale@leadingagile.com. It's probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay. All right. Well, cool. Thanks for doing this. Enjoyed it.
All right. Appreciate it, Leland.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.